It was a bitterly cold morning in the quiet town of Elkhollow, Tennessee. The kind of morning where the mist clings low to the ground and even the sun seems hesitant to rise. Inside the sheriff's office, everything felt ordinary. The ticking of a wall clock, the low hum of the heater, and the smell of stale coffee hanging in the air. That was until an eerie sound broke through it all. A long, aching whimper, like a cry from a soul on the edge. Deputy Hal Mercer furrowed his brow and stood up from his desk. He wasn't the kind of man to be easily shaken, not after 27 years on the force. But something about that sound pulled at him, not fear exactly, but a strange urgency. As he reached the front door and slowly opened it, what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. There, standing in the freezing wind, was a German shepherd, her fur matted with mud and dried blood, her body trembling violently. But it was her belly that struck him hardest. She was pregnant, far along, and her eyes, God, those eyes, were wide with something deeper than pain. They were filled with pleading, as if she knew exactly where she was, and had come here on purpose. The dog took one shaky step forward, then another, before collapsing on the cold tile floor just inside the door. She didn't growl. She didn't cry out. She simply lay there, chest heaving, staring up at Hal with a look that said one thing: "Help me." Around her, other deputies gathered in silence, their usual composure slipping away. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all felt it. Something terrible had happened. Old scars circled her neck like rings from a lifetime of chains, and her paws were raw and cracked open from walking too far for too long. But she had made it. Somehow, through whatever horror she had escaped, she had made it to them. And now, every second felt critical. The unborn lives inside her were moving, but weak. Hal knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her side. She didn't flinch. She only closed her eyes, surrendering her last strength to strangers. But what none of them knew, not yet, was that this wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of a story that would haunt their hearts. Because what this dog had been through, what she had survived to protect, was something far darker than any of them were prepared to face. The small-town clinic was just minutes away, but every second in that patrol car felt like an eternity. Deputy Hal drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gently resting on the German shepherd's side, feeling her labored breathing beneath the thin blanket someone had thrown over her. In the back seat, the dog barely moved. Her name was still a mystery, but Hal had already started calling her Ruth, a name his mother used to say meant compassion in old stories. By the time they arrived, Dr. Madeline Kerr, the town's only veterinarian and a friend to the department, was already waiting outside. Her eyes widened the moment she saw the dog. "Dear Lord," she whispered, rushing to help them carry Ruth inside. The clinic was warm and smelled of antiseptic and hay, and for a brief moment, Ruth's eyes opened. She looked around as if to say, "Is this finally a safe place?" Madeline worked quickly, checking vitals, cleaning wounds, and monitoring the fragile lives inside Ruth's swollen belly. Hal stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest, not saying much, but his eyes never left Ruth. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft beep of monitors and the scratch of Madeline's pen. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and troubled. "She's been through hell, Hal. Malnourished, dehydrated, and those scars. She's been chained for years. But that's not the worst of it." Hal's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" Madeline paused, looking at him with a weight in her eyes that only long-time caregivers carry. "I think she was used for breeding, repeatedly, and recently abandoned when she couldn't produce anymore. Or maybe because these pups weren't part of someone's plan." Her voice cracked slightly, and based on the bruising, it looks like she was kicked hard. Someone didn't want her making it this far. Hal clenched his jaw, turning away to hide the heat rising in his eyes. This town had its fair share of dark corners, but the thought of someone doing this to a dog, especially one carrying life, made his blood boil. And yet, somehow, Ruth had escaped. Somehow, she had found her way to them. It wasn't just survival. It was purpose. She had fought for those unborn pups, And now the fight wasn't over. As Madeline worked, Hal stepped outside, breathing in the cold air, trying to calm the storm inside him. But just as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands, his phone buzzed. It was Deputy Lyle, still back at the station. His voice was low, cautious. "Hal, I think we found where she came from, and you're not gonna like it." Hal froze. His gut already knew. Whatever was waiting on the other end of that lead wasn't just going to change Ruth's future. It was about to unravel something much deeper in their town's past. Hal didn't say a word on the drive back. The world outside the cruiser seemed grayer than usual, as if even the landscape had sensed something wasn't right. He gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Lyle's voice still echoed in his mind. "It's that old place out on Whitlow Road, the abandoned farmhouse, the one tied to the Ramsey family." Hal had known the Ramseys when he was young. A proud family that fell apart decades ago under a cloud of rumors, money, and cruelty that no one in town ever spoke about anymore. The Ramsey farmhouse had long since rotted into a skeleton of its former self. Windows shattered, siding falling away, the land overgrown and forgotten. But now Hal stood outside it again, as if time had folded in on itself. As he and Lyle pushed the door open, the first thing that hit them was the smell. Urine, decay, something darker. The inside was worse than he imagined. Cages stacked like prison cells, chains nailed to walls, bones in the corner, gnawed raw. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, documenting what they could. In the back room, Hal found a blood-stained blanket and half-eaten food dumped into a rusted bowl. Lyle knelt near a metal tag on the floor, bent, but still legible. "Ruthie," it read. Hal's breath caught. It wasn't just a name he made up. It was hers. She had belonged here or been trapped here, and had somehow clawed her way out. The pain in Hal's chest deepened. What kind of life had this poor creature endured? And what kind of person had left her to die? Later, at the station, they combed through old property records and vet reports. What they found was worse than they expected. The Ramsey property had been sold quietly 5 years earlier to a man named Curtis Mornell, a recluse with a sealed juvenile record and a history of animal cruelty in another state. No one in town had seen him in years. Hal stared at the man's photo on the screen, something in his eyes that made his stomach turn. Cold, hollow, dangerous. That night, Hal couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his kitchen with the lights off, staring out at the darkness beyond the window. His old dog, Jasper, lay at his feet, twitching gently in sleep. Hal reached down and ran a hand over Jasper's back, but his mind was elsewhere, with Ruth, with her unborn pups, with the nightmare she had run from. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Curtis was still out there, and Hal knew men like him didn't just stop. They escalated. Back at the clinic, Ruth stirred for the first time in hours. Her breathing had stabilized, but her eyes remained closed. Madeline watched over her like a sentry, and then, just after midnight, Ruth's body tensed. The monitor beeped faster. It was time. The pups were coming. But Madeline saw something that made her heart skip. Ruth was struggling, too weak. Something was wrong. And in that quiet, sterile room, as the first contractions began, the real fight for life and for redemption was about to begin. Dr. Madeline Kerr moved fast. Her hands, though steady, were tight with urgency as she examined Ruth's weakening body. The contractions had started, but the dog wasn't responding like she should. Her breathing was shallow, her muscles too fatigued to push. Madeline knew the signs. She'd delivered hundreds of litters before, and this wasn't right. One wrong moment and they could lose all of it. Not just the puppies. Ruth too. She quickly called her assistant, Ellen, who rushed in barefoot and half asleep, tying her hair back while slipping on gloves. "She's crashing," Madeline said, her voice low and tight. "We might need to go in." Ellen looked at the vitals, then back at Ruth's pale gums. "She won't survive surgery, not in this state." Madeline nodded, already knowing it. The room was filled with quiet panic, the kind that settles into your bones and tells you the stakes are far too high. Meanwhile, Hal paced in the clinic lobby, feeling helpless for the first time in years. He was a man used to solving problems with action, kicking down doors, following leads, making arrests. But this was different. This was life or death playing out in a way he couldn't touch. The door creaked behind him. It was Sheriff Boone, older and quieter now, with more gray in his beard than memory in his eyes. "Heard it was bad," he said, watching Hal closely. Hal didn't answer. Boone sighed. "You're taking this personal." Hal finally looked at him. "Shouldn't we all?" Back in the exam room, Ruth let out a weak whimper, her first sound in hours. It broke something in Madeline. "Come on, girl," she whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You didn't come all this way to quit now." At last, a shift, a push, then another. The first puppy came, still lifeless. Ellen caught it, cleared its airway, rubbed it gently. Seconds passed, then a gasp, a twitch, a cry. The room exhaled together. One made it, then another followed, then a third. But Ruth was fading. Each puppy born took more out of her. Her breathing slowed between contractions. Her eyes fluttered open only once, locking with Madeline's before closing again. The fourth pup arrived small, quiet, and didn't move. Ellen tried, but it never took a breath. Madeline felt a sob rise in her throat but swallowed it down. The fifth came, alive but weak. "That's all," Ellen said softly. Ruth was still, too still. Madeline leaned in, pressed her stethoscope to Ruth's chest. For a moment, nothing. Then faintly a heartbeat. Faint, but present. Madeline closed her eyes, whispered, "You're still here. Stay. Just a little longer." Outside the exam room, Hal stared through the small glass window, his breath fogging it. And he knew. Something had shifted. Something inside him. He wasn't just trying to save a dog anymore. He was trying to save a story. One this town had tried too long to ignore. The next morning, the world outside seemed quieter, like it was holding its breath. Inside the clinic, Hal sat motionless by Ruth's kennel. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't slept. The four puppies were curled up against their mother's side, making faint, rhythmic sounds that somehow felt sacred. Ruth was alive, but barely. Her breath was shallow, her body spent. Hal kept his eyes on her, heart heavy with a feeling he couldn't quite explain. Not pity, but something deeper, like recognition. Sheriff Boone had stopped by early, bringing with him a manila folder of old, nearly forgotten reports. Complaints of barking from the Ramsey property, allegations of missing pets, strange noises at night. Nothing had ever been confirmed. Nothing had ever been investigated properly. But Hal was seeing it all differently now. The cages, the scars, the tag, the bullet lodged in Ruth's shoulder, recently discovered on her x-ray. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tried to erase her. Dr. Madeline's voice broke the silence. "She was shot, Hal. Not long ago. Maybe a week." Hal's jaw tightened. "So she didn't just escape," he said quietly. "She survived an execution." His words hung in the air like smoke. The idea that someone would look into Ruth's eyes, those desperate, loyal eyes, and pull a trigger was too much to stomach. And yet it had happened. And it meant that whoever was behind it wasn't just cruel. They were covering something up. Back at the sheriff's office, Deputy Lyle dug deeper. A new document surfaced, a photo from years ago, tucked inside an old file. It showed Curtis Mornell as a teenager, standing beside another boy. Lyle didn't recognize him at first, but something about the face tugged at his memory. He brought the photo to Hal. This you?" Hal stared at it, stunned. Younger, thinner, eyes full of things he no longer remembered clearly. And beside him, Curtis, friend once, before everything changed. Before Curtis disappeared into his grandfather's farm and the town forgot him. Hal sat back, breath caught in his throat. All these years, that connection had been buried, erased by time and shame. Ruth hadn't just led them to a crime. She had led Hal straight into a part of his past he thought was dead and gone. And as the wind howled outside the clinic walls, Hal finally realized this wasn't just about saving her. It was about finally facing the boy he used to be, and the monster that boy once called friend. Hal sat alone in his truck, parked along the narrow gravel road leading to the old Ramsey property. The picture still rested on the passenger seat. The faded photo of two boys who once shared secrets, adventures, and a darkness no child should have carried. He hadn't spoken Curtis Mornell's name in over 30 years. Not since that summer when everything fell apart. And now here he was again, staring at the remnants of a man who'd chosen cruelty over conscience. But Hal wasn't just chasing a criminal. He was chasing the shadow of who he used to be. Back at the clinic, Ruth stirred weakly in her sleep. The pups were stronger now, feeding more often, their tiny bodies twitching with life. But Madeline noticed something that made her stomach turn. The smallest puppy, the one with the white streak down its back, had stopped nursing. It was cold to the touch, its movements sluggish. She wrapped it in a towel, heart pounding. Ruth opened her eyes and let out a soft whine, almost like she knew. Madeline swallowed her fear and whispered, "I've got you. Baby, stay with me." Sheriff Boone called Hal just before sundown. "You're not gonna like this," he warned. "Mornell's trailer? Burned down sometime last night. Someone torched it. Nothing left but ashes and tracks heading west. Like he knew we were closing in." Hal didn't respond right away. The weight of the timing was too precise. The fire, the bullet, the silence from the town. Curtis was running, and not for the first time. Hal knew the pattern, the urge to vanish when things got too real. Hal drove straight back to the clinic. When he walked through the door, Madeline didn't have to say anything. He saw it in her eyes. She handed him the smallest pup, still wrapped in the towel. "I don't think he's gonna make it," she whispered. Hal looked down at the tiny creature in his hands, heart aching in a way that caught him off guard. "Come on," he whispered. "You're a fighter, just like your mama." He sat beside Ruth's kennel again, watching her weakly lift her head, eyes meeting his with something that looked like sorrow, or maybe understanding. For a long time there was silence, just the hum of the clinic lights, the ticking of the wall clock, and the fragile sound of life hanging on by threads. And somewhere in that stillness, Hal made a quiet decision. He wasn't going to let Curtis disappear again. Not this time. Not while this dog, this mother, had nearly died trying to escape the legacy they both came from. The next time he saw Curtis Mornell, it wouldn't be as an old friend. It would be as the man who'd finally come to end the story they started as boys. The next morning brought a harsh wind and the kind of gray sky that felt like it pressed down on the earth. Hal stood outside the clinic, eyes fixed on the horizon. Ruth's smallest pup still wrapped against his chest. It had made it through the night, barely, but Hal knew time was running out, not just for the puppy, but for the truth. Curtis was gone, but not far. Hal could feel it in his bones. The same instinct that once told him to run was now telling him to chase. Boone handed Hal a folder as he approached. "Got something," he said. "Old land registry shows Mornell's family owned a hunting cabin up near Dry Hollow Ridge. It's not listed anymore. No electricity. No phone. Off-grid for decades." Hal scanned the map. It was deep in the woods, easy to miss, easy to hide. Just the kind of place Curtis would go to disappear. And just like that, the hunt began. Hal didn't wait for backup. He loaded up with a flashlight, his old service revolver, and a photo of Ruth tucked into his coat pocket. Not for evidence, but for strength. As he drove north, winding through dirt paths and frozen creeks, memories flooded back. That summer, long ago, when he and Curtis built tree forts and traded secrets. Hal remembered the day Curtis stopped talking about his home, the bruises, the way his eyes changed, and how Hal, scared and unsure, did nothing. Hours later, the cabin appeared through the trees, slanted, overgrown, nearly swallowed by the forest. Hal stepped out of the truck slowly, every sound amplified by tension. The wind, the creak of branches, a distant rustle. He circled around the side, boots crunching over dead leaves, until he saw the door, slightly ajar. He drew his weapon. "Curtis," he called out, voice firm but cold. "It's Hal. We need to talk." No answer, just silence. Then, a floorboard creaked inside. Hal stepped forward, heart pounding, every nerve on fire. Inside, the air was thick with rot and smoke. Animal cages lined the far wall. Empty. Blood stains on the floor. And in the corner, a single mattress. Someone had been there. Recently. Then a movement. Hal turned, finger on the trigger, just as a shadow darted through the back hallway. He followed, breath shallow. "Curtis," he growled. "You run again. I swear to God I won't miss." And somewhere deeper inside the dark, a voice finally answered. Low, mocking. "You should have stayed gone, Hal." Hal stepped into the dark hallway, his flashlight trembling just slightly in his hand. The floor groaned beneath his boots as he moved forward, every breath sharp, every step calculated. He could hear Curtis now, pacing, breathing heavily, somewhere near the back of the cabin. The air stank of rust and old fear. This place was more than a hideout. It was a graveyard of things that were never buried right. And now everything was surfacing. "I didn't think you'd come," Curtis said, his voice echoing from the shadows. Hal turned the corner, flashlight catching his face. Older, sunken, but the same cruel eyes. Curtis sat near the back window, a shotgun leaning casually against the wall behind him. "You always were the one who looked away, Hal. Thought you were better than me. Thought you didn't come from the same rot." Hal's jaw clenched. "I did come from it, but I didn't let it turn me into this." Curtis laughed, a sound dry and bitter. "Don't act like you cared about that dog. You cared because it reminded you of everything you tried to forget. You're not here for justice. You're here to feel clean." The words hit harder than Hal expected, because somewhere inside them, there was truth. Ruth wasn't just a rescue. She was a mirror, and seeing her suffer cracked something inside him that had been sealed since childhood. "I came," Hal said quietly, "because someone has to stop this, and because you didn't just hurt her, you made her carry your violence in her body, and she still crawled to us. You left her to die, Curtis, and she survived you." Hal took one step closer, hand on his weapon. "But I'm not walking away this time." Curtis's eyes flicked toward the shotgun behind him. Hal saw it, but so did the weight of years between them. "Go ahead," Hal said, voice steady. "Be the monster, or be the coward you've always been." Curtis didn't reach. Not for the gun, not for the door. He just sat there, silent, broken in a way Hal had never seen before. And as the backup sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer through the woods, Hal lowered his weapon slowly. It was over. Not clean, not victorious, but over. And somewhere, miles away, in a quiet clinic warmed by dim light and soft breathing, Ruth stirred in her sleep, as if something inside her finally let go. The next day, the sky over Elkhollow was washed in a soft gold. It was the kind of morning that made the town feel whole again, even if nothing truly was. Hal stood outside the clinic, coffee in hand, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. The silence felt different now, not empty but necessary. Sheriff Boone had handled the arrest quietly. Curtis had gone without a word. No resistance, no regret. Just a blank face and the weight of decades finally pressing down. Inside, Ruth rested, her strength slowly returning. The pups were nursing again, all four of them, even the little one with the white streak, who had begun to show signs of fight. Madeline smiled as she checked vitals. "She's responding," she said, almost to herself. "She's not out of the woods, but she's trying." Hal watched through the glass, arms folded, something tight in his chest beginning to loosen. He hadn't realized how much of himself had been tangled in that dog's survival. Later that afternoon, Hal finally entered Ruth's kennel. She lifted her head, weak but aware, and gently nudged his hand with her nose. He knelt beside her, resting a hand on her side, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath beneath his palm. "You brought me back," he whispered. "I thought I was the one saving you." She blinked slowly, then leaned her head against his leg. It wasn't just connection. It was forgiveness, silent and absolute. Boone stopped by with updates. Curtis was being transferred out of county. More investigations were opening. Other towns, other missing animals. A trail too long and ugly to process all at once. "It won't be over for a while," Boone said, voice low. Hal nodded. "It's not supposed to be easy." For the first time in years, they both understood that justice didn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just meant making sure the pain didn't repeat. That evening, Hal sat on the clinic porch with Jasper, watching the sun dip below the hills. Madeline joined him, handing him a folder. Inside were adoption inquiries, people from nearby towns who'd heard Ruth's story. "You could keep them," she said. "All of them. Wouldn't surprise anyone." Hal chuckled softly. "I don't think Jasper would appreciate a full-time daycare." But even as he said it, he felt something shift. He wasn't sure he was ready to let Ruth go. As the night settled in, Hal walked back inside and stood beside Ruth's kennel one last time. The puppies were sleeping, tiny breaths rising in sync with hers. Hal looked down and whispered, "You came here to survive, but you gave me more than that." He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, heart full of things he couldn't name, knowing that the next chapter, for both of them, was finally theirs to write. 2 weeks later, Elkhollow felt different. The wind was softer, the nights quieter. Word of Ruth's survival had spread beyond the county lines. First through whispers, then through news stories. Pregnant dog walks miles after being shot. Finds shelter in local sheriff's office. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the ones nobody else saw. Like the way Hal stayed late at the clinic every night. Or how Ruth's eyes followed him with calm recognition whenever he entered the room. The pups had names now: Millie, Hank, Clover, and the smallest one, Ghost. Hal had insisted on that last one. "Because he nearly slipped through," he said. But he didn't. Ruth had gained weight, her coat healthier, her steps steadier. And though she still flinched at sudden noises, she was healing. Day by day, inch by inch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And that was enough. Madeline handed Hal the final paperwork one morning. Ruth had been officially cleared for adoption. "So," she asked with a smile, "still thinking of letting her go?" Hal didn't answer right away. He looked through the window, watching Ruth play with her pups in the small grass pen behind the clinic. Something about the way she moved, cautious but free, reminded him of himself, of the long road it had taken to get here. "No," he said softly. "I think she already chose." The adoption day was simple. No cameras, no fanfare, just Hal, standing in the middle of his living room, opening the back door to his old farm property as Ruth and the pups explored slowly, Jasper trailing behind with mild disapproval. The house felt alive again, not noisy, but full. The kind of full that isn't measured in volume, but in presence, in heart, in things finally finding their place. That night, Hal sat on his porch, wrapped in an old quilt, Ghost curled up at his feet and Ruth laying beside him, head resting on his boot. The stars were brighter than usual, or maybe he was just seeing them differently. He thought about the past, about Curtis, about choices, about silence that stretched across decades. And then he thought about Ruth, how she chose to live, to trust, to keep going, even when the world tried to break her. Hal looked down at her and whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" Ruth didn't move. She just sighed, the kind of sigh that says everything without a single sound. And in that moment, surrounded by stars, scars, and second chances, Hal finally understood. Some stories don't need to end in noise or vengeance. Sometimes they end with a quiet redemption, and a dog who refused to die without being seen.